The number one American vehicle built and made around the world is the Ford F-Series trucks. They're all aluminum. And they buy it from Quebec. Hit those things and I think, you know what, some of that pressure of the self-inflicted harm that they're doing on the U.S. auto sector is starting to finally bubble up.
After months of escalating trade tensions, August 1st marked another sharp turn. Donald Trump's administration raised tariffs on Canadian goods not covered by the USMCA. And this time, steel took center stage. Steel and aluminum now face a 50% levy, the highest among all sectors. It's not the first tariff Canada has faced under Trump, but it's the most economically disruptive and symbolically aggressive. What's different now isn't just the number, it's the target. Steel isn't a fringe export. It's the backbone of Canada's contribution to North America's auto supply chain. And by striking at this core, Trump isn't just pressuring Canada. He's shaking the very structure of his own industrial base.
It was a tremendous impact. I mean, these are customers and distributors we had been dealing with for many, many years. Unfortunately, the threat of the tariffs was enough to create an uncertain business climate. So our American business evaporated essentially overnight in February.
Canada supplies vast amounts of steel and auto parts to U.S. car makers, from chassis frames to precision components. When tariffs climb, Canadian exporters are often the first to feel the squeeze. The Canadian Auto Parts Manufacturers Association reports that exports to the U.S. have already dropped by 25 to 35%, depending on the company. That's not just numbers. Those are lost contracts, idle factories, and laid-off workers. In Toronto, a manufacturer like Conquest Steel experienced a sharp collapse in its U.S. orders earlier this year, not because of actual tariff enforcement, but because of uncertainty. The fear of policy instability alone was enough to freeze cross-border business. Still, rather than retaliate hastily, many in Canada are pivoting. Companies are refocusing on domestic customers, creating new product lines, and investing in long-term manufacturing capacity. Prime Minister Mark Carney's approach isn't about short-term revenge. It's about structural resilience.
I'm listening to Ford and General Motors, who are pivotal in this, starting to say things like, you're burning all of our profit.
Yet as Canadian suppliers reel from the tariffs, the pain isn't stopping at the border. The shock is rippling straight into Detroit. The U.S. auto industry depends on Canadian steel and aluminum, especially for high-volume vehicles like the Ford F-Series, which relies heavily on aluminum from Quebec. As raw material prices rise, so does the cost of assembly. Automakers can't simply switch suppliers overnight. Industry estimates warn that U.S. vehicle prices could rise by several $1,000s depending on the model, materials, and sourcing, with some projections reaching as high as $9,000 in the most tariff-exposed cases. Trump may be aiming at Canada, but the hit is landing in Michigan. This trade move wasn't born from long-term strategy. It was part of a broader performance. Trump imposed a rigid August 1st deadline and challenged countries to accept bilateral deals, many of them thin on structural substance. Canada refused to follow the pattern. While Japan, Korea, and parts of the EU agreed to expedited deals, Canada held its ground. According to Jean Charest, a senior member of Canada's U.S. Relations Council, many of these agreements are already showing signs of strain. Canada chose not to rush, and for good reason. Carney's government made it clear, a bad deal signed under pressure isn't worth the ink.
If the White House does things that are good for Detroit, they're going to be good for Ontario. The problem is they're aiming at everywhere and hitting us all, and they're going to sink important American companies along the way.
Trump's steel tariffs were meant to punish a neighbor, but the consequences may be greater for his own economy. While Canada is adapting, investing inward, and planning beyond the U.S. market, American automakers are locked into a disrupted supply chain with rising costs and no clear off-ramp. This isn't just a bilateral dispute. It's a test of economic leadership, and as the pressure mounts, it's becoming clear. Canada may be taking the hit, but it's America's industrial base that's absorbing the blow.
So today we heard from GM. This is exactly what we are seeing, what we're projecting, and specifically they announced a $1.1 billion hit to profit in the second quarter.
Anything built with steel, you've seen the cost go up 30% in the U.S.
Steel, aluminum, auto parts. They don't make headlines every day, but right now, they're at the center of one of the biggest economic standoffs in North America. Since returning to the White House, President Trump has brought back tariffs as the cornerstone of U.S. trade policy. His approach? Aggressive, unpredictable, and increasingly personal, even toward allies like Canada. As of mid-2025, Canada faces up to 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum, and 25% on all imported auto parts under the latest round of Trump's reciprocal tariff strategy. The policy was meant to protect American jobs. Instead, it's triggered a chain reaction, starting with Canada's steel industry.
He goes down that road. I wouldn't recommend the president going down that road, because every tariff on Canada is a tax on Americans.
Faced with mounting tariffs, Canada didn't wait to plead for exemptions. It pivoted. Led by Ontario, provinces began rebuilding domestic production. Premier Doug Ford announced support for reindustrializing everything from aluminum cans to I-beams and rebar. The federal government under Prime Minister Mark Carney followed suit, launching targeted subsidies, cutting red tape, and fast-tracking investment approvals. The result? A national push to reduce reliance on U.S. steel and harden Canada's industrial resilience. But the shift wasn't just about survival. It was strategic. Canada's new steel capacity is being redirected toward domestic auto production and exports to Asia and Europe, bypassing the United States entirely. This isn't just a policy response, it's an economic transformation, and it's already reshaping the broader North American auto market.
And so what that tells you is there are higher import costs because you have to pay that tariff when that part or that car is coming over the border. If GM and Stellantis, these are American car companies that are getting hit by this.
Trump's tariffs weren't supposed to hurt U.S. manufacturers. But the damage is happening, fast. In the second quarter of 2025, General Motors reported a $1.1 billion loss directly tied to higher input costs. Stellantis followed with a $2.7 billion hit in the first half of the year. Both companies pointed to rising prices on steel, aluminum, and components that now cross the US-Canada-Mexico border multiple times, each leg of the journey triggering new duties. These companies had spent years building supply chains under the USMCA framework, a system Trump himself helped renegotiate. Now, his own tariffs are making that system unworkable. U.S. steel prices have risen by up to 30% since March, according to the American Iron and Steel Institute. For automakers, that translates into an added $2,000 to $4,700 in production costs per vehicle. Companies tried to cushion the blow with limited-time employee pricing incentives, but those savings can't cover billion-dollar quarterly losses. And there's another layer: inflation. Economists from the Congressional Budget Office warn that increased production costs in the auto sector could push up overall consumer inflation in the second half of 2025.
Because Canada is in a position where it can afford to be patient. The most important thing that we can remember that is true about Canada that is not necessarily true for other countries is no deal is better than a bad deal.
As Canadian provinces unite around Carney's negotiating position, the contrast with Washington couldn't be starker. Trump continues to float tariff figures anywhere from 15% to 50%, depending on what country he says is friendly or not getting along. In recent weeks, Japan and the UK have each accepted 15% tariff deals. But Canada, the US's largest single buyer of goods, is holding out. Why? Because every Canadian premier, regardless of political party, now agrees. No deal is better than a bad deal. And a bad deal would lock in tariffs that could cripple industries for decades. Meanwhile, the lack of consistency in U.S. trade messaging is creating a climate of confusion for American businesses. No one knows what rules will apply next quarter, or even next week. Trump's tariffs were pitched as a tool to force better deals abroad. But the fallout is landing at home. In Canada, they've sparked a national industrial revival. In the U.S., They're squeezing auto manufacturers, disrupting supply chains, and raising prices for consumers. This isn't just a backfire, it's a warning. That unpredictable trade policy doesn't just alienate partners, it turns into a tax on your own economy. And this time, Canada is no longer waiting at the table. It's building something stronger, and it's building it without asking permission.
Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum said on Wednesday that she and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney had agreed to strengthen trade collaboration.
And as countries seek other export markets, that's going to reduce the supply to U.S. markets.
The real cost of tariffs isn't just measured in dollars, it's trust, lost, and perhaps unrecoverable. Across global supply chains, confidence in the United States as a stable trade partner is wearing thin. Under President Trump's latest wave of tariffs, countries are no longer simply adjusting. They're rethinking their entire strategy. In Canada, that shift is especially visible. What began as a policy response to U.S. tariffs is now a national effort to reduce dependency on American goods, services, and even markets. Ottawa is strengthening trade ties with Europe, Mexico, and Asia. It's also prioritizing domestic production. The message is clear. If economic loyalty is punished, independence becomes a necessity. This erosion of trust is not just a diplomatic concern. It's reshaping where countries buy, sell, and invest for the long run.
And it is day 177 of the second Trump administration. And tonight, new inflation numbers are confirming what many economists have predicted, that Trump's tariffs would drive prices higher and higher.
For American consumers, the impact is now undeniable. According to the latest Consumer Price Index, inflation in June rose 2.7% year over year. Housing led the surge, but food, fuel, and durable goods also ticked up. Economists from Bank of America and Wells Fargo confirm what many feared. Tariff costs are filtering directly into retail prices. Yale Budget Lab projects that average U.S. import taxes could exceed 20% by August, an historic peak. Early year stockpiling delayed the pain, but that cushion is gone. As inventories run dry, companies are now restocking at tariff-inflated prices. That shift is beginning to show on the shelves.
As shoppers push their carts through the door, Urban Grocer is quietly pushing back, steering clear of anything grown in the U.S. Now that's been the case here for 117 days and counting.
Retail, that's a boycott.
North of the border, Canada's response is firm and deliberate. In British Columbia, a local grocer hasn't stocked U.S.-grown produce in over 117 days. What started as a modest cut quickly became a full phase-out. According to Nielsen IQ, American food product sales in Canada dropped 8.5% by volume in just a few months.
More Canadians come to America than tourists from any other country. Last year, Canadians made over 20 million visits to the U.S. and spent more than $20 billion here. But this year, many are not coming to America.
Tourism tells the same story. In June, car crossings from Canada into the U.S. fell 33%, the sixth month in a row of decline. In Vermont, resorts and breweries report a 30 to 50% drop in Canadian visitors. Some towns renamed streets and offered exchange rate discounts, but the absence is about more than pricing. To many Canadians, this is no longer a consumer choice. It's a political stance, driven by rhetoric they see as disrespectful and aggressive. Meanwhile, the U.S. market is feeling the deeper effects. As foreign suppliers redirect exports elsewhere, American buyers face fewer options and rising costs. Countries like Vietnam, Peru, Egypt, and South Africa are already filling Canada's supply gaps. Importers in the U.S. now face higher logistics costs, increased paperwork, and volatile pricing. And with more goods subject to tariffs, the ripple effects are spreading through manufacturing and retail. This isn't just a foreign tax anymore. It's becoming a domestic burden. President Trump points to rising tariff revenues, $64 billion in Q2 alone, as proof of success. But these gains come with growing inflation, trade distortions, and a widening credibility gap. Canada, led by Prime Minister Mark Carney, is emerging as a quiet but determined counterforce. Rather than respond with threats, Canada is playing a longer game, diversifying trade, reshaping supply chains, and building internal resilience. And that's where this all leads. The tariffs may raise revenue in the short term, but in the long term, they may cost the U.S. the one thing that made it a global trade leader: reliability. Because once allies start walking away, it's hard to bring them back.
As soon as Donald Trump was elected and began talking about repealing the IRA and the subsidies, we told them all Ontario is 100% in with the subsidies that, with the investments, as we call them, that we agreed to in the first place. With or without the IRA, you can count on Ontario.
In the middle of one of the most uncertain chapters in North American trade, Canada is holding the line. As President Trump ramps up tariff threats and strips away nearly all electric vehicle subsidies in the United States, the logic would suggest Canada should pull back, rethink its own plans, reassess the risks. But that's not what's happening. From Windsor to St. Thomas and across Ontario's industrial heartland, Canada is doubling down. Its electric vehicle strategy isn't just surviving the pressure, it's becoming a symbol of economic sovereignty.
The path to a possible deal is riddled with uncertainty, and on top of tariffs, U.S. President Donald Trump's big, beautiful bill leaves some big, unanswered questions about the future of electric vehicles in Canada.
Last week, President Trump signed the Big Beautiful Bill, which effectively repealed most federal tax credits for electric vehicles in the U.S. For Canada, this was a major disruption. Many of its EV investments, over 30 billion Canadian dollars in joint federal-provincial commitments, were designed with alignment to the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. Battery hubs like Windsor and St. Thomas were suddenly exposed to market risk. Honda even paused its project for 2 years. But instead of pulling back, Ontario responded with clarity. Every dollar committed will remain committed. The province, along with the federal government, is protecting 100,000 existing auto jobs and aiming to create tens of thousands more. A $30 billion contingency, described as firepower, has been set aside to support manufacturers through tax relief and targeted programs. Ontario is also making a broader point: that Canada remains a stable, rules-based environment. Over the last 2 years, it has attracted 184 international companies, secured $70 billion in new investment, and created 18,000 manufacturing jobs. As global firms look for alternatives to the volatility in U.S. politics, Canada is offering reliability. Despite policy headwinds, the electric vehicle market is not slowing down. Global EV sales rose 25% in 2024, according to the International Energy Agency. Canada's federal mandate to require 20% of all new vehicle sales to be electric by 2026 remains unchanged. While some automakers are asking for delays, Ontario argues that abandoning the target would risk wasting billions already invested in infrastructure and production. By staying on course, Canada positions itself as a credible EV hub for Europe and Asia, partners looking for supply chains that aren't bound to Washington's policy swings. This isn't just industrial planning, it's an insurance policy. All of this plays out under the shadow of looming tariffs. President Trump has threatened to impose a 35% tariff on Canadian goods starting August 1st, unless a new trade agreement is reached. Talks are ongoing, but the Canadian side admits there's little visibility. Even ministers say privately that they don't know how close or far apart the two sides are. Still, Ontario is preparing for every outcome. The EV investments are not contingent on Washington's behavior. And if a deal doesn't come, the transition doesn't stop. It continues, backed by the funding and political will already in motion.
Hopefully, we can manage that number down, and hopefully we can preserve our broader market access. But gosh, it's so challenging.
Canada's insistence on holding the EV line is about more than electric cars. It's about proving that a country can chart its own course, even in the face of economic pressure from its largest trading partner. In a world of volatile politics, trust is currency, and Canada is betting that, in the long run, trust will outlast tariffs.
You know, I grew up in Canada, where the entire trade mechanism is built toward trading with the United States. Canada's actively seeking to diversify its own trade relations. It's currently trying to finalize a free trade deal with a bloc of South Asian countries.
When President Trump talks trade, he talks about strength, about using tariffs to bring countries to the table. But as the summer of 2025 unfolds, something unusual is happening. The table is getting emptier. Yes, the talks are technically still on. Canada is negotiating. The EU hasn't walked away. Mexico is sending messages. But make no mistake, behind the press briefings and formal letters, America's closest allies are pulling back. And in the process, Trump's tariff strategy is not just straining relationships abroad. It's also hitting the U.S. economy at home. Hard.
This is America's biggest trading partner. Other countries are doing similar things. They're trying to figure out how to be less reliant on a trading partner that is unreliable and unpredictable.
After months of stalled dialogue, Trump's new round of tariff letters landed with a thud. 35% duties on Canadian goods, 30% on EU and Mexican exports, and 50% on copper, pharmaceuticals, and other sensitive items. The backlash was strategic. Canada accelerated deals with South Asia. The EU delayed its countermeasures but drafted a massive $72 billion retaliation list. Mexico continued talks but with reduced optimism. None of these countries slammed the door, but none are treating the US as a reliable partner anymore. Instead, they're working on long-term alternatives, and America is no longer in the center of their plans.
Past 3 months, this is when the tariffs went into place and companies either decided to absorb some of that, get inventory ahead of that deadline, or start to pass some of that on to the consumers.
While allies quietly pulled back, the real pain began showing up inside the U.S. economy. The 50% tariff on copper raised immediate concerns. The U.S. imports over half of its refined copper from allies like Canada, Peru, and Chile. But domestic refining capacity is limited. Tariffs only raised the cost, without improving supply. It was the same story with Brazilian coffee. With a 50% duty in place, prices spiked. But coffee isn't produced at scale in the US, except in Hawaii. Importing alternatives simply isn't feasible. American consumers bore the cost, with no gain in strategic security. Meanwhile, US companies and financial institutions began closely tracking the fallout. According to CBS News reporting, many businesses either tried to absorb the new costs, front-load inventory, or passed prices on to consumers. Attention also turned to household spending. Banks were watching whether American consumers, already stretched by inflation, were cutting back or falling behind on payments. Another area under scrutiny was investment. IPO activity and corporate mergers began to stall, driven by rising input costs and trade uncertainty. These developments raised questions not just about current earnings, but about confidence in the economy's direction. And as President Trump continued to publicly pressure the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates, especially around real estate, analysts noted that the White House was now seeking monetary relief to offset disruptions that its own trade decisions had helped create. Beyond immediate inflation and investment drag, a deeper shift is underway. The EU has signaled that its next wave of retaliation may target U.S. services, intellectual property, digital platforms, financial products. These are areas where the U.S. traditionally runs a surplus. If that surplus erodes, the U.S. loses not just income, but influence. Meanwhile, Canada is reviewing export permits for strategic minerals, including rare earths, copper, and uranium. Limiting exports to the U.S. would disrupt supply chains for EVs, AI chips, and clean tech manufacturing. According to projections from the IMF in June, a full trade breakdown with Canada and the EU could reduce U.S. GDP by up to 0.4%, with long-term investment loss in advanced sectors. What's emerging is not just a trade dispute, it's a structural split in the global economy, with the U.S. drifting to the sidelines.
Well, I think that's the key question, is what deal will be credible, will be sustainable, given the extreme uncertainty that's coming out of the Trump White House.
President Trump has argued that tough tariffs show strength. But what they've shown instead is isolation. While allies build new partnerships, the U.S. faces rising costs, anxious markets, and a weakening position in global trade. In the end, it's not just about how high the tariffs go, it's about how much trust is left when the dust settles. And right now, America's trading partners are quietly rebuilding a world that doesn't rely on Washington.